All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating, I think, the world of social structures.
Okay.
But we're going beyond some of those kind of like old ideas of society as like one big whole.
Right.
And we're going to be exploring this idea called assemblage theory.
Okay.
And our guide for this is going to be Manuel DeLanda's book,
All right.
A New Philosophy of Society.
So what's really cool about DeLanda is he
Okay.
throws out this idea
Yeah.
that society is like an organism
Yeah.
or like a seamless whole.
Okay.
And instead, he wants us to see it as
Right.
all these interconnected but distinct entities called assemblages.
So instead of this big blob, we should be thinking about all these separate pieces linked together.
Exactly.
What kind of pieces are we even talking about here?
So think about like individuals,
Okay.
the networks that we form,
Okay.
organizations we're part of,
Yeah, yeah.
cities, countries.
Gotcha.
These are all assemblages in DeLanda's model.
Okay.
And the key here is that these pieces, these assemblages, aren't
Right,
just nestled inside of each other like Russian dolls.
Right, okay.
They're way more fluid,
Yeah.
way more interconnected.
Okay, so why is this assemblage idea
Yeah.
so different from just thinking about it as this totality?
So the problem with the totality view is that it assumes that the parts
Right.
are only what they are because of their place in the whole.
Okay.
DeLanda calls this relations of interiority.
Okay.
This idea that if you take the part out of the whole, it loses all meaning.
Gotcha.
So like a heart is only a heart because it's part of a body.
Right, yeah, so you're saying DeLanda kind of flips that idea on its head
Exactly.
instead of interiority.
He emphasizes relations of exteriority.
Okay.
So that means that parts have their own properties.
Okay.
They can exist independent of the whole,
Yeah.
but they come together to create that whole.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm already starting to think about all the different parts that make up my world. But can you give me a concrete example of how this exteriority thing actually plays out?
Sure. So DeLanda gives this example of a wasp and an orchid.
Okay.
They have this symbiotic relationship, right?
Okay.
The wasp needs the orchid for food.
Right.
The orchid needs the wasp for pollination.
Gotcha.
But the wasp isn't defined by its relationship with the orchid.
Okay.
It has its own separate life cycle,
Gotcha.
and it can interact with other plants.
So it's like this partnership
Exactly.
where they both benefit,
Yeah.
but they still maintain their independence.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
Um,
It definitely makes me rethink this whole society as an organism idea.
That's exactly what he wants us to do.
Okay.
He says, even something as tightly integrated as a human body can be seen as an assemblage.
Okay.
All the different organs, they need each other.
Right.
But they also have their own developmental history,
Yeah.
and they can function somewhat independently.
So we're starting to see how things that we normally think of as these wholes are actually made up of these distinct interacting parts.
Yeah.
But how do these assemblages actually change?
So DeLanda uses these two terms,
Okay.
territorialization and deterritorialization.
Okay.
And so territorialization is that process that stabilizes an assemblage.
Okay.
Its boundaries become clear,
Right.
its identity solidifies.
So if you think about a community,
Yeah.
like territorialization might be those routines,
That's a
the
great
unwritten
comparison.
rules that everyone follows, and that creates that sense of belonging.
Exactly. It gives that community a distinct identity,
Yeah.
and it makes it feel stable.
But things change.
But
Communities aren't static.
Right.
So that's where deterritorialization comes in.
Exactly right.
So that's like the disruption.
Yeah, the force that disrupts destabilizes
Oh, wait.
assemblages.
Gotcha.
So think about
Okay.
like a new technology that changes how people communicate,
Right.
or a social movement that challenges the community's norms.
Ooh. I like that. So it's this push and pull
It's a constant
between these two forces.
right, push and pull between those two forces.
Sometimes things settle into these stable patterns,
Yeah.
and then something comes along and shakes everything up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the dynamic nature of assemblages.
Yeah.
It's not a static picture.
Right.
It's constantly becoming.
Okay, so we're moving away from thinking about society as this one thing.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see it as this collection of interconnected assemblages,
Mhm.
each with its own properties and dynamics.
Exactly.
But how does this help us understand
Yeah.
how things happen in the world?
So that's where things get
Yeah.
even more interesting.
Okay.
And it leads us to assemblage theory and causality.
Causality.
Yeah, this whole idea of cause and effect.
Isn't that kind of straightforward?
For some things, yes.
Okay.
That's linear causality.
Okay.
The same cause, the same effect every time.
So if I drop a ball, it's going to fall to the ground.
Right. But DeLanda says that social systems aren't always that simple.
Okay.
And he brings in the idea of nonlinear causality.
Okay, so in social systems, things don't always follow a straight line.
Exactly.
Okay.
Small changes can have huge effects.
Gotcha.
Sometimes big events barely make a dent.
Right.
There are thresholds and tipping points.
Okay.
And feedback loops that make it really hard to predict what will happen.
This is making me think about that butterfly effect.
That's a perfect analogy.
A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil,
Right.
and a hurricane happens in Florida.
It illustrates how sensitive social systems can be
Right.
to these seemingly small events.
Gotcha. But when we're dealing with like populations and stuff,
Yeah.
it gets even more complex because of statistical causality.
Right. So think about it this way.
Okay.
External factors
Yeah.
might influence the probability of something happening rather than guaranteeing it.
Gotcha.
So, like smoking doesn't guarantee you'll get cancer,
Right.
but it increases the risk.
Yeah, so it's not, this will always lead to that.
Exactly.
It's about understanding the
Yeah.
odds of it happening.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this brings in the role of chance in social processes.
Okay.
So DeLanda is saying that not everything is predetermined.
Right.
There's room for genuine novelty and surprise.
Yeah.
And that makes analyzing social phenomenon a lot more interesting.
Okay, so this is blowing my mind a little.
Good.
But where do we fit into all this?
Okay.
We've talked about these larger assemblages,
Yeah.
but how does the individual person emerge?
So that's a great question. And it leads us to DeLanda's exploration of philosopher David Hume.
Okay.
And his ideas about how subjectivity,
Right,
our
yeah.
own individual experience of the world,
Right.
comes to be.
Okay, so back to the philosophy books.
Exactly.
Remind me, what was Hume all about?
So Hume was all about empiricism.
Okay.
This idea that knowledge comes from our senses,
Right.
from our experiences of the world. And he uses this to explain how our internal world, our subjectivity,
Okay.
emerges.
Gotcha.
And it all starts with those sensory impressions.
So our eyes, ears, nose,
Yeah.
taking in information from the world around us.
Yeah.
But how do those sensory impressions
Yeah.
turn into thoughts, feelings, all that stuff that makes up our inner world?
So from those impressions, we form ideas.
Okay.
And here's the wild part.
Okay.
He didn't think language was involved
Okay.
or social conventions.
Interesting.
He saw ideas as basically copies of impressions, just less intense.
So our thoughts are like
Yeah,
echoes of our senses,
Right.
fainter versions of those original impressions.
Exactly.
Okay, like that.
so those impressions are really vivid.
Yeah.
And then the ideas are
Mhm.
kind of a fainter copy.
Gotcha. But how do those individual impressions and ideas come together
Yeah,
to form our experience of the world?
that's where he brings in this idea of the association of ideas. So he proposed 3 ways that our minds connect these pieces.
Okay.
Through contiguity,
Yeah.
resemblance,
Okay.
and cause and effect.
All right. Break those down for me.
Okay, so contiguity means grouping ideas based on closeness in space or time.
Okay.
So being in a certain place can trigger a memory
Right.
or events that happen around the same time
Yeah.
become linked in your mind
So our brains are always making these connections
Right.
based on,
Yeah.
what's going on around us.
based on proximity in space and time.
Okay, what about resemblance?
Resemblance is linking ideas based on their similarity.
Okay.
So we might group different types of fruit together
Yeah.
or see patterns in events that seem totally unrelated.
Gotcha.
Our minds are always looking for connections.
Yeah.
And then cause and effect is how we learn to link actions and consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So we learn that certain behaviors lead to certain outcomes,
Right.
which helps us navigate the world
Right.
and make decisions.
So according to Hume, these 3 ways of associating ideas
Right.
are how our minds create order out of this chaos of impressions.
That's right.
It's like our brains are constantly weaving these threads of experience
Yeah.
to make a tapestry that makes sense to us.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And through this process, a sense of self emerges, a
Yeah.
coherent subjective experience.
This is so fascinating. I'm starting to see myself as this
Yeah.
constantly evolving tapestry shaped by my experiences.
Right.
But you said Hume didn't think language was involved in this
Yeah, in the initial process of
initial process, right?
forming ideas and a sense of self.
Where does language come in?
So language is crucial,
Okay.
but in this model, it's not the foundation.
Okay.
It comes in later
Yeah.
as this powerful tool that augments our thinking.
Okay.
And it massively increases our
Right.
possibilities for connecting and combining
Wow.
all those impressions and ideas.
So it's like language takes those basic building blocks that are already there and
Yeah,
gives us
you're
this
close.
whole new set of tools to work with them.
Yeah, get us a new set of tools.
So we can express ourselves,
Mhm.
share our thoughts and feelings,
Exactly.
build entire worlds through stories.
Right. Language is so powerful.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to think that
Yeah.
the foundation of our inner world
Right.
might exist independently of language.
Okay.
So how do we understand
Right.
consciousness and cognition,
Yeah.
if that's the case?
My mind is officially blown.
Good.
I'm starting to see how my own sense of self
Yeah.
came to be.
Right.
But how do we go from me to we?
Okay, that's a good question.
Like, where do communities and organizations
Right.
fit into all of this?
So to explore that connection,
Yeah.
DeLanda turns to the work of sociologist Irving Goffman,
Okay.
who was fascinated by
Yeah.
how individuals present themselves in social interactions.
So how we act around other people
Ex-
putting on that mask.
It's more nuanced than just wearing a mask,
Okay.
but that's a good starting point.
Right.
Goffman argued that every interaction is a performance
Okay.
where we make claims to certain identities.
Okay.
We do this through our words, gestures, even our silences.
So every time we step into a social situation,
Yeah.
we're putting on a show,
We are performing, yeah.
trying to project this particular image of ourselves to others.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay.
And what's interesting is
Yeah.
these performances aren't just about how others perceive us.
Okay.
They also shape our own sense of self.
So we're not just these isolated individuals with our own separate experiences. We're
yeah.
constantly shaping and being shaped.
By those interactions
Right.
with others.
Okay, I like that.
And this is where conversations become so important
Okay.
in DeLanda's framework.
Conversations as assemblages.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So think about it.
Okay.
Conversations have these material components,
Okay.
like the people involved. Right.
Their physical presence, the time and energy they're investing, even the air they breathe.
Wow.
Then there are the expressive components.
Yeah.
Like the words being spoken, the tone of voice, body language.
So it totally fits the assemblage model.
It does.
And I guess these conversational assemblages, they create this space for individuals to connect, share ideas, and negotiate their identities.
Exactly.
Okay.
Goffman was really interested in
Yeah.
how conversations establish boundaries,
Okay.
both in space and time.
So we have these ways of signaling
Right.
the start and the end of an interaction.
Exactly.
And rules for
Right.
taking turns and maintaining that flow of communication.
Yeah, there's these unspoken rules.
It's like this unspoken code for
Exactly.
how conversations work.
And those help to territorialize.
Right.
That conversational assemblage
Right.
creates a sense of order and predictability.
But conversations can be unpredictable too.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when
Especially
we're talking about,
things we disagree on.
yeah, or sensitive topics.
Right, right.
Those are deterritorializing moments.
Okay.
The points where things can get messy
Okay.
and unpredictable.
Gotcha.
Goffman called them eventful or fateful situations.
Okay.
They offer both risks and opportunities.
So like a heated debate
Yeah, exactly.
or a heartfelt confession.
Right, it shakes things up.
Could be a deterritorializing event.
And it leads to these unexpected outcomes.
And it's in those moments that we often see
Exactly.
people's true colors
Yeah.
revealed.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm starting to see conversations in a whole new light.
Okay.
They're not just
Yeah.
idle chit-chat.
Right.
They're these complex, dynamic assemblages
Exactly.
with their own internal forces.
Yeah.
Okay, but one more thing about language.
Okay.
We've been talking about how it shapes our beliefs
Right.
and how we present ourselves to others.
Right.
But there's this difference between what words mean and what they do in the world.
You're talking about the difference between signification
Yeah,
and significance.
exactly.
That's a key distinction.
So, like, sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it.
Exactly.
Or even that you said it at all that has the most impact.
Right. And that's what Goffman was so interested in.
Yeah.
He said, we need to pay attention to the consequences of what we say,
Okay.
the pragmatic effects of language.
Right. Yeah.
And this is really important when we start talking about larger social assemblages like communities and networks.
Okay, so let's make that jump then.
Okay.
We've explored how individuals emerge as subjects
Yeah.
and how they interact through these conversational assemblages.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do we understand those interpersonal networks?
So for DeLanda, interpersonal networks are assemblages in their own right.
Okay.
They're made up of individuals,
right?
but they have these properties that go beyond the sum of their parts.
So it's not just about who you know. It's
Exactly.
about the patterns of connection.
Right, the dynamics that emerge within those networks.
And just like any other assemblage,
Yeah.
networks have these material and expressive components.
That's right.
What kind of material stuff makes up a network?
So think about the time and energy that people put into maintaining relationships.
Okay.
That's a finite resource,
Yeah.
and it shapes the size and structure of their networks.
Right.
There's also the exchange of physical aid,
Okay.
like helping someone move, caring for their kids.
So it's not just about socializing.
Yeah.
It's about these tangible acts of support.
Right.
Reciprocity.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there are the expressive components.
Yeah.
So think about shared stories, inside jokes,
Right.
those cherished memories.
Yeah. The stuff that binds people together.
Exactly. That
Right.
create that sense of belonging.
Okay, so I'm seeing those pieces coming together, but what about those territorializing and deterritorializing forces?
Yeah, so conflict
That,
is a major territorializing force.
Oh.
When a network experiences conflict,
right.
it sharpens group boundaries and increases internal cohesion.
So the us versus them,
Exactly.
when a group feels they're threatened,
Right.
they band together.
Right, they reinforce their identity.
Right, but that can have a downside too.
It can.
Like it can lead to exclusionary practices.
That's right.
And limit individual freedom within the group.
Exactly. So it's this double-edged sword.
Right.
It strengthens bonds, but at the cost of...
Suppressing individual expression and difference. Okay, so what about deterritorialization in these networks?
So deterritorialization can be driven by things like
Okay.
social mobility,
Okay.
secularization,
Right.
technology.
Right.
So as people move around,
Right.
become less tied to religious institutions
Yeah.
and connect more online,
Right.
those traditional community boundaries
Yeah.
become more fluid and porous.
This is making me think about the dynamics of my own networks. You
Yeah.
know, it's not just about who I know, but
Yeah, right.
how those connections are formed, maintained,
Yeah.
and broken.
That's right.
But how do these networks interact with
Right.
organizations and institutions?
So DeLanda points out that individuals are often part of multiple assemblages simultaneously.
Right.
And sometimes those affiliations can clash.
So I might be part of a close-knit friend group
Right.
that has very different values from my company.
Exactly. And when those values come into conflict,
Right.
that can create some serious challenges
Yeah.
for the individual.
Like navigating multiple worlds,
Yeah.
each with their own set of rules.
And those worlds don't always stay neatly separated.
Okay.
Sometimes the boundaries between personal networks
Right.
and those institutional organizations can blur,
Okay.
and that creates even more complexity.
Okay, so how do we analyze
Yeah.
those situations where different types of assemblages are interacting?
So a perfect example of that is social movements. DeLanda draws on the work of Charles Tilly.
All right. Social movements,
Yep.
protests, demonstrations, those efforts to create social change.
You got it. And Tilly took an assemblage approach to these movements.
Okay.
And he looked at how all these various factors
Yeah.
interact to shape their emergence, their actions, their outcomes.
So a social movement isn't just this spontaneous eruption of anger.
Right.
There's structure there. There's
Right.
a logic to how it operates.
Exactly. Tilly argued that these movements are made up of
Right.
diverse actors,
Okay.
each with their own motivations and resources.
Right.
And they engage in strategic actions
Okay.
aimed at specific goals.
So it's not just shouting slogans.
Yeah.
There's a lot more going on.
There's planning, organizing, coalition building.
Okay.
All of that's crucial
Gotcha.
to whether a movement will succeed or fail.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Okay.
How does Tilly analyze these movements?
So he starts by identifying the core actors. Usually it's a community or a group of communities
Right.
that feel marginalized or mistreated
Okay.
by those in power.
So those who are demanding recognition or rights?
Exactly, something they feel has been denied to them.
Yeah.
And so this aggrieved community
Okay.
needs to interact with another key actor,
Okay.
the government organization
Okay.
that holds the power to address those demands.
So it's this dynamic between those seeking change
Exactly.
and those who are in a position to enact it.
You got it,
Yeah.
but it's not always a simple two-way street.
Okay.
There's often a third actor,
All right.
a counter movement, a group that opposes the demands
Right.
of that aggrieved community.
So there are these multiple forces at play.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Tilly emphasizes that The government itself isn't this monolithic entity. It's made up of different agencies and actors, each with their own agendas and interests.
So it's not just about convincing the government as a whole. It's about understanding those internal power dynamics.
Exactly.
And figuring out who the key decision makers are.
Exactly, how to influence them.
Okay.
And this is where Tilley's analysis of how social movements communicate their demands gets really interesting.
So their tactics, like protests, demonstrations, marches.
Yes, but he goes deeper than that.
Okay.
He argues that social movements need to project a certain image to both their opponents and the government.
So it's not just making noise, it's strategically crafting a message.
Exactly.
This narrative.
Tilley calls this the repertoire of contention.
Okay.
So it's that set of expressive displays that a movement uses to demonstrate its legitimacy, its unity, its strength.
So things like public meetings, marches, petitions.
Right, even the slogans.
Even the slogans,
The symbols.
All about crafting that image.
Exactly, and that repertoire has evolved over time.
Okay.
Tilley traces a shift from those more direct actions, like riots and property destruction, to those more symbolic and organized forms of protest.
So from breaking machines to waving banners.
Exactly.
What drove that shift?
Part of it was the changing nature of the state.
Okay.
As governments became more complex and bureaucratic, social movements had to adapt their tactics.
Gotcha. So they had to learn to play the game.
Exactly.
Use the system's own rules to their advantage.
Right. And this shift towards more organized forms of protest also required more lasting organizations, unions, activist groups, and so on.
So those organizations became key components of the assemblage.
Exactly. But there's also this fascinating dynamic with language.
Okay.
Remember those us versus them narratives?
Yeah.
Tilley argued that those are crucial to how social movements define themselves and mobilize support.
So it's creating that clear sense of who's on your side.
Exactly.
And who's the enemy.
That's right.
And rallying people.
Yeah, it's a very powerful way to rally people to a cause.
Right.
But Tilley goes even deeper.
Okay.
And shows how the categories we use to define social groups become battlegrounds in these struggles for social change.
What do you mean by that?
So think about categories like race, gender, or class.
Okay.
These aren't just neutral descriptors. They're often linked to power relations and access to resources.
Who gets labeled white or black or male or female has real-world consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Tilley argues that social movements often aim to challenge those existing categories.
Right.
Either by creating new ones that better reflect their experiences or by demanding that the government recognize and address the inequalities linked to those categories.
So it's about changing how we think and talk about social groups, but also using those categories to push for tangible changes in policy.
Exactly. How resources are distributed.
Wow. Okay.
So it's this fascinating example of how language, power, and social action are all intertwined in these social movement assemblages.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how social movements work. It's not just about passion and outrage.
It's about strategy.
Strategy, organization, communication, even the categories we use to define ourselves and others.
This is all a lot to process.
I bet.
We've gone from these individuals forming ideas based on their senses to entire social movements challenging those in power.
That's right. So before we were talking about social movements.
Yeah, those movements that can challenge those institutions.
It's that classic power struggle, right? And it leads us right into DeLanda's analysis of those institutions themselves.
Okay.
The Goliaths of the social world.
Okay, so we're moving from the rebels to the empires.
Exactly. We're zooming in on organizations.
Businesses, government agencies, universities.
So those formal structures.
Yeah, those formal structures that play such a big role in our everyday lives.
Okay, so when we're talking about these organizations, where do we even begin?
So DeLanda argues that the key features across most organizations is this concept of authority.
Okay.
That structure of power, that hierarchy.
Right, so who's in charge?
Exactly, who's calling the shots.
But it's not always as simple as, boss says everyone jumps.
It's not always that simple.
Right.
So that's why he distinguishes between those expressive elements that legitimize authority and the material components that enforce it.
Ooh, interesting. Give me an example of how those play out.
Sure. let's take a company.
Okay.
The CEO has the authority to make decisions, right?
Right.
But there are all these things that make that authority seem legit.
Okay.
Like their experience. The company's culture, the stories that people tell about the CEO.
Right, okay.
And then you have the ways to actually enforce those decisions.
Yeah.
Performance reviews, bonuses.
Gotcha.
Even the fear of getting fired.
It's like a carrot and stick approach.
Yeah.
But with storytelling and image building thrown in?
Exactly. It's that combination
of
making authority feel justified.
Right.
And having the means to back it up.
No, DeLanda mentions the sociologist, Max Weber.
Max Weber.
And his ideas about different types of authority.
Yes, super relevant.
Okay.
Weber identified 3 main types of authority.
Okay.
Rational legal, traditional, and charismatic.
All right. What makes them different?
So rational legal authority is all about rules.
Okay.
Procedures, formal structures.
Okay.
Think of modern bureaucracies.
Right.
Where people are hired and promoted based on qualifications.
Okay.
And decisions are made according to guidelines.
So that's like the classic by the book.
Exactly. Follow the rules to a T. Now contrast that with traditional authority.
Okay.
Which is based on customs.
Okay.
Inherited status.
Yeah.
The way things have always been done.
So like monarchies.
Exactly.
Okay.
Where power is passed down through the generations.
Okay, so we've got follow the rules and respect tradition.
Yeah.
What about charismatic authority?
So charismatic authority is all about the personal qualities of a leader.
Right.
Their magnetism, their vision,
right.
Their ability to inspire.
Okay.
Think about figures like Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
or Nelson Mandela.
They weren't relying on rules or tradition.
No, their power came from that ability to move people with their words and their presence.
And you see how those different types of authority play out.
Yeah, definitely.
In the real world.
A company might have a super by-the-book structure.
Right.
But also have this CEO with tons of charisma.
Right.
Who really inspires.
He rallies the troops.
Exactly.
And what DeLanda finds fascinating about rational legal authority is how it embodies those relations of exteriority.
Exactly.
Remind me how that works again.
So in a rational legal system, it doesn't really matter who the person is.
Okay.
It's the role they occupy in the structure.
Gotcha.
So if the CEO quits, the company can keep going.
Right.
Because the authority is tied to the position.
Yeah. No one is indispensable.
Exactly. But even in these systems where the rules are king, there's still people involved.
Right.
So DeLanda goes right into the material components of organizations.
Okay.
And at the heart of it all are human bodies.
Of course.
Right. At the end of the day, is people who make the decisions.
Do the work. Keep things running.
Exactly. But DeLanda also points out how those human bodies are subject to control within the organization.
Right.
And he draws on Michel Foucault's work to explain how power works through discipline.
Discipline.
Yeah, like being sent to the principal's office.
Right.
But Foucault was more interested in
those subtle forms of discipline that shape our behavior in everyday spaces.
Okay.
And he said, modern organizations are really good at monitoring and regulating what people do.
So it's not just about punishing people when they break the rules.
Right.
It's shaping their behavior beforehand.
Exactly. To make sure they stay in line.
So like the design of office spaces.
Exactly. The schedules, the performance reviews.
It's all about creating a system that encourages conformity.
That's right.
And efficiency.
Yes.
This is kind of creepy when you think about it.
Right. Foucault would say that's the whole point.
Yeah.
These techniques are often invisible or taken for granted, which makes them even more powerful.
It's like the air we breathe.
Yeah.
We don't notice it till it's gone.
Exactly.
Or till we feel like we're suffocating.
Right.
Okay, so we've got the human bodies being disciplined and regulated.
Yeah.
What about those expressive components?
So in those rational legal systems.
Yeah. Legitimacy comes down to effectiveness.
Okay.
Like, hey, this system works.
Right.
We're getting results.
Right.
We're efficient.
Gotcha.
We're making a positive impact.
So trust us. We know what we're doing.
Exactly.
Because look at all this good stuff.
Yeah, look at our achievements.
And that's where expertise becomes important.
Exactly. Specialized knowledge.
And that's why you see so many professionals in these organizations don't question our authority.
Right.
We have the degrees and the data.
That's right.
Okay.
And those claims to knowledge can be reinforced by things like certifications, academic journals.
Right.
even just the sheer volume of information.
So it's that classic knowledge is power.
Exactly.
The more expertise they can claim, the more authority they seem to have.
But DeLanda points out that this can create these interesting power dynamics. Sometimes the very industries that a government agency is supposed to regulate end up supplying the agency with the information they need to do their job.
So the regulators become reliant on the people they're supposed to be keeping in check.
Exactly. It can create some major conflicts of interest.
Yeah, that seems like a recipe for trouble.
And it highlights how those neat hierarchies that we often imagine within organizations can be much messier in reality.
It's more like a tangled web than a neat pyramid.
Exactly. There are these interdependencies, power struggles going on that really shape how things work.
Okay, so I'm getting a much clearer picture of how individual humans become part of these machines, how their behavior gets shaped, and how the organizations build up their authority. But how do organizations themselves
That's a great question.
interact with each other?
So it takes us to another level of analysis.
Okay.
Networks of organizations.
Okay.
Just like individuals form networks.
Right.
So do these larger institutions...
So we're talking about industry groups, professional associations.
Exactly. Government agencies.
Together.
Working on joint projects.
Okay.
And just like interpersonal networks.
Yeah.
These networks of organizations can be super complex.
Okay.
And there are varying levels of power and influence at play.
So we got webs within webs.
Exactly. Individuals and organizations, and those organizations forming their own networks.
Yeah.
And these networks take different shapes.
Okay.
Some are more hierarchical.
Okay.
With clear lines of authority.
Okay.
While others are more collaborative and decentralized.
So we've got the top down and then the flexible, free-flowing.
Exactly. To illustrate the contrast.
Yeah.
DeLanda compares Silicon Valley in California with Route 128.
In Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts.
Okay, so I bet Silicon Valley is like networked collaborative.
The example, of this fast-paced, innovative culture.
Yeah.
Companies share information.
Right.
They work together.
Gotcha.
They even steal each other's employees.
It's like a jungle, but there's lots of cross-pollination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What about Route 128?
So that's the opposite.
Yeah, so Route 128 represents a more old-school, hierarchical model.
Okay.
Companies tended to be larger.
Okay.
More self-contained.
Right.
More secretive.
So they're guarding their secrets, protecting their turf.
You got it.
Okay.
And while they had some success for a while, they eventually struggled to keep up with the rapid changes in the tech world.
They're like the dinosaurs that couldn't adapt.
That's right.
So is DeLanda saying that the networked approach is always better?
He's not making those kinds of sweeping judgments.
Okay.
He recognizes that both models have their strengths and weaknesses.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Exactly. The best approach depends on the industry, the technology, even the social and cultural context.
Okay, so what about those territorializing and deterritorializing forces?
Yeah, so in the
Silicon Valley. Yeah. That territorialization is tied to the region itself.
Okay.
So the concentration of companies, the talent pool, all those flows of ideas and information that are centered there.
So it's like a magnet.
Exactly. It's pulling in all those resources and that talent.
Right.
But that very concentration can lead to deterritorialization as companies grow.
Yeah.
They may become less dependent on that specific location.
Right. It's like a plant that outgrows its pot.
Exactly.
And they spread their operations.
Yeah.
What about hierarchical networks like Route 128?
So in those cases, the boundaries are often internal.
Okay.
They create those clear hierarchies.
Right.
They control the flow of information.
Gotcha.
Within the network and try to keep things tightly controlled.
So they're building fortresses. Yeah. Strong walls.
Yeah.
Clear chain of command.
But that can make them vulnerable.
It can't.
Deterritorialization.
Right.
It's like a house of cards. You pull the wrong one out.
Exactly.
And the whole thing collapses.
That's right.
This is all super fascinating.
Good.
I'm starting to see how these networks of organizations with all their power dynamics can shape entire industries and regions.
That's right.
But how do they fit into the even bigger picture?
So DeLanda doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He goes on to show how all these different scales are interconnected.
Okay.
How they influence each other.
Gotcha.
And he says that we can't reduce these larger assemblages like cities to just collections of organizations and buildings.
So a city is more than just the sum of its parts.
Absolutely. They have their own emergent properties, their unique vibes and histories.
It's about how those pieces fit together.
You got it.
Yeah.
All those relationships.
The relationships, yeah.
The stories, the events that have shaped the city's identity.
So the design of a city can actually influence how people interact.
Absolutely.
Okay.
DeLanda uses this concept of locales to analyze how those physical spaces, the buildings, the streets, the parks, shape how social life unfolds.
So a park can become...
a central gathering spot. Or a busy street corner. Attracts vendors and performers.
It's like a stage set.
Exactly.
Shaping the performance.
And so DeLanda really analyzes these urban assemblages.
Yeah.
And he starts with individual buildings.
Okay, so he zooms in.
The most basic unit of urban space.
And even a single building
can be analyzed.
Can be an assemblage.
As an assemblage.
Okay.
It has material components. The materials used to build it, the way it's structured, the location within the city.
So the architecture.
Whether it's an apartment building or a skyscraper.
That plays a role.
Yeah, how it functions. How people experience it.
Okay.
And then there are the expressive components.
Okay.
Like the style.
Yeah.
The way it's decorated, even the building's name.
Okay.
All of those convey meaning. Shape how people interact with the building.
So like a grand imposing building projects power and authority, and a cozy building feels more inviting and accessible.
Exactly. And these expressive elements are constantly being negotiated and reinterpreted as people interact.
So it's like the building itself is a participant in the social life of the city.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And DeLanda looks at the connectivity of the building, how those doors, hallways, elevators influence the flow of people and the types of interactions.
So it's not just about the building itself, but how it's connected to other building.
Yeah, to the larger...
the urban fabric.
Exactly.
And those connections are constantly changing. Think
I mean,
about cities grow and evolve.
The elevator transformed the vertical connectivity of buildings.
Those skyscrapers.
Exactly. Amazing how technology can impact
them. Simple technological innovation changes how a city looks and feels.
DeLanda doesn't stop at individual buildings, right?
He doesn't. He analyzes how they come together to form neighborhoods.
Okay.
How those neighborhoods are linked to form districts, and how all that contributes to the city.
So it's like those Russian dolls again.
I love that analogy.
But instead of nesting, they're all interconnected.
Each layer has its own unique dynamics. Emergent properties.
This is giving me a whole new appreciation for how cities work.
But what about those bigger forces that shape the city?
Yeah, so DeLanda acknowledges that those are crucial. He talks about processes like congregation and segregation that shape neighborhoods.
Congregation.
Yeah, congregation is when people with similar interests or backgrounds choose to live near each other. And segregation is when they're forced apart.
So those patterns can be driven by...
Yeah, it can be driven by social class, ethnicity, religion, even lifestyle choices.
So a neighborhood can be known for its artistic community?
Exactly.
Or its immigrant population?
Or its tech startups.
By choice or by circumstance.
That's right. And those patterns has a huge impact on social dynamics, economic opportunities.
So the more people with similar interests move, the more it attracts others like them.
Exactly.
But that can lead to divisions too, right?
It can. It can lead to those social and economic divisions.
Like the haves and have-nots?
Yeah.
Those areas with lots of resources.
Yeah. DeLanda doesn't shy away from those challenges. He talks about how land use, transportation, access to resources play a role in how cities grow and develop. Who benefits from that growth?
So it's this constant tug of war between...
different interests.
Different interests.
And he uses a term called land succession. To describe how different uses of land, whether it's for housing or business or industry
Okay.
compete for space.
So that explains why those neighborhoods go through transformations.
Exactly.
From residential to commercial.
That's right.
From industrial to trendy lofts.
Yeah, those changes can be driven by things like new transportation routes, shifts in the economy, even just changes in taste.
Right. It's that game of musical chairs.
Exactly.
But with city blocks changing hands.
But those shifts can also lead to people being pushed out of their homes.
Right, like with gentrification.
Exactly, and rising rents force.
Yet.
Longtime residents to move.
And it highlights how those dynamics can create opportunities for some while displacing others.
Right, DeLanda's not pretending that cities are these utopian spaces.
Yeah.
They're complex systems with winners and losers.
Okay, this is making me rethink my own city. Starting to notice all these different forces at play.
That's what we want you to do.
The economic pressures.
Right.
The social divisions. The way it's constantly changing.
Yeah, it's constantly evolving.
Right. But how do those urban assemblages relate to nations?
So that's a great question.
Yeah.
It takes us to the highest level of scale that DeLanda explores, territorial states.
Okay.
And he reminds us not to oversimplify nations.
Right.
They're not just pieces of land with a flag and a set of laws.
So it's more than its government.
Exactly, or its borders.
Yeah.
They're complex assemblages with their own histories, cultures, social dynamics.
Right.
And those elements shape how they interact with the cities within their borders.
So it's not just the nation dictating everything to the cities.
DeLanda emphasizes that cities have a certain degree of autonomy.
Okay.
And their relationship with the nation can be cooperative. And conflictual.
So they can push back against national policies.
That's right.
Try to carve out their own role.
Exactly.
Think about cities like New York or London that become global financial centers.
Right.
That extend beyond their national borders.
Exactly. They become like mini nations within nations.
But how does this all play out with territorializing and deterritorializing? So
one way nations try to territorialize is by creating that sense of shared national identity.
Okay.
Through symbols, holidays, narratives about shared history and values.
So creating that sense of belonging, that we're part of something bigger.
Exactly.
Okay.
But those efforts can be challenged by things like migration, global trade, the flow of information.
So the more interconnected the world becomes,
the harder it is
to maintain.
For nations to maintain those clear boundaries.
Right.
And that sense of unity.
Right.
And this tension between those forces that bind nations together and those that pull them apart.
Right.
Is playing out in really interesting ways today.
Yeah.
In today's world.
Yeah, this has been an incredible journey.
It has.
We've gone from buildings.
That's right.
To global cities, to entire nations.
Yeah, we've seen how those scales.
And seeing how all those scales are connected.
Right, how they influence each other.
This framework is pushing us to see society.
Not as a static thing.
Not as this static thing,
But as an ongoing process.
Right, constantly evolving.
Of becoming shaped by countless interactions.
I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. But also, I feel like I'm seeing the world in a new way.
That's what's so exciting.
Noticing connections and dynamics I might have overlooked before.
That's the power of assemblage theory.
It helps us grapple with the complexity.
That's right.
Without shying away from it.
Exactly.
It's like we've been given this new set of lenses.
Yes.
To see the underlying pattern.
That's right.
And forces that are constantly shaping the world.
Exactly. But before we wrap up.
Yeah.
I think it's time to take a moment.
Right.
Let all of this new information sink in.
Okay.
And we'll be back.
Yeah.
In a flash.
Right.
To share some final thoughts.
Okay. Okay, we're back.
Back from our little mental break.
Yeah, I needed that.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to step back and let it all sink in.
Seriously.
What a journey through assemblage theory.
It was.
It really is a lot to absorb. Yeah, from individuals to these massive systems like nations.
Right, and every layer in between.
It really makes you realize
how
much is going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, but instead of feeling overwhelmed by all that complexity, I actually kind of feel energized.
That's the beauty of it.
By this new way of seeing the world.
Exactly. It's not about feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
It's about embracing that complexity.
And one of the things I really appreciate about assemblage theory is it doesn't offer these easy answers or simple solutions.
Right. It acknowledges
I'm not a recipe book.
That there are no one-size-fits-all solutions to social problems.
It's about understanding those unique dynamics at play.
In every situation.
In each situation.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked a lot about these larger systems and their emergent properties. But one of the key takeaways for me is this idea that individuals still matter.
That's so important.
Yeah.
Assemblage theory doesn't lose sight of the individual.
We're not just cogs in a machine.
Right. We have agency.
Right.
We made choices that influence the systems around us.
So it's this kind of like interplay.
Yeah, a constant interplay.
Between structure and agency.
Between structure and agency.
I'm curious, what are some of the things that stood out for you?
So for me, it's that reminder
Yeah.
that social change isn't always linear or predictable.
Right. It's not always the steady march of progress.
Exactly. Sometimes it's those sudden bursts of transformation.
And those unexpected events.
Those moments of deterritorialization.
That really shake things up.
That reshape the landscape.
So it's not enough to just analyze those existing structures.
Right.
We also have to pay attention to those moments.
Yeah, those cracks.
Where things break down.
And new possibilities emerge.
Where new possibilities can emerge.
And this deep dive has definitely sparked a lot of new thoughts and questions for me.
That's what we want.
Yeah, like I'm looking at the world around me.
And noticing all these connections and dynamics.
So as you go about your day, I encourage you to look around with those assemblage theory glasses on.
Yeah.
Notice those connections, those moments of territorialization, deterritorialization.
Ask yourself
how this framework helps you make sense of your own experiences. Your relationships. The social and political issues.
It's about taking this theoretical framework.
Yeah, and making it real.
And applying it.
To those everyday observations.
To those everyday observations, yeah.
Interactions.
Who knows? We might even discover insights that DeLanda never even considered.
And that's what makes a good theory so powerful. It sparks new questions.
New questions, new ways of seeing.
Exactly.
And a deeper appreciation for the complexity.
Of this world.
Yeah.
We're all a part of.
Well, this has been an incredible exploration.
It has.
Of assemblage theory.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface.
We've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, but we hope.
But hopefully,
this has given you
a new way to think about society.
Some new tools.
And your place within it.
To think about the world.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
On this deep dive into assemblage theory.
And keep those intellectual gears turning. And we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive